let's just start off. Before we get into the Native Reads program, I was wondering, Mabel Picotte, I was wondering if you could maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Oak Lake and your role in the Writers Society.
Okay. Hello, my name is Mabel Picotte. Living from the Ihangtoa tribe, living in Sisseton. Uh, Oak Lake Writers Society. Well, the society organizes literary effects for purposes of preserving and defending Oceti Shakopee cultures, oral traditions, and histories, and to reaffirm our people's political statuses and to regulate and transform representations of such that are inaccurate and damaging. The Oak Lake Writers Society originated in 1993 and was started by South Dakota State University professors Charles Woodard and Lowell Amiat, and was kind of members of SDSU and the Brookings community started hosting these tribal writers and mentors at the Oak Lake Field Station, which is located near Astoria, South Dakota. Myself, I've been a member of the organization since I think around 2008. Does anyone else want to add about their experience? Because I know we're all from Oak Lake Writers Society.
Maybe Lanniko can fill in about the history of the organization and how it got started.
Okay. Well, in 1993, Lowell Amiat and Chuck Woodard, as Mabel was just mentioning, decided that they wanted to provide a voice for the Native students, not just on the campus, but a way for members who were writing or had aspirations to write, who had published, that they would be able to come together on an annual basis and exchange ideas, to also have workshops that took place during the retreats that were held initially in October. And our first mentor, that was another thing that Lowell and Chuck did, was to provide professional writers who are of First Nations. And so they were able to guide a portion of the retreats every summer. In that first experience, we had N. Scott Momaday. And so he provided a wonderful beginning for this society to have a foothold in what we thought, and we still think we are on that path, to have more people in the Native Oceti Shakopee communities grow their future in writing and develop a genre, a literary footprint for our people, that all of our young people would be able to have access to the kind of work that we aspired to do. So in that first retreat, we set up some goals and we had some writing that took place. We had a guide, Momaday guided us through that first session, and he did editing along with Dr. Woodard and Elizabeth Cook Lynn. And the outcome of that first retreat was an anthology. It was Woyake Kinikia, an anthology of Dakota Lakota storytellers. And it was published in a very primitive way, considering now what the technology can do. The anthology had a volume. We did a volume 1, which was June of 1994. And although I attended and had other, I was a reader, but I was not one of the producers. The individuals who were there involved in that were Joyzelle Godfrey, and she was assisted by Florestine Renville German, Eldon Lawrence, Darius Renville, and Lydia Whirlwind Soldier. And during that time, Elizabeth Cook Lynn served as our technical advisor. So we had our first launch of our ability to provide the beginning of a literary track was that first journal. It was a tribal model literary journal is what we called it. And it was published in 1994. At that particular time, the press was located at Crow Creek Indian Reservation in Fort Thompson. So we have, and I don't have all of them, but I know members of the society have copies of following anthologies until we got to the point where we were able to seek a publishing entity, which began with Lydia Whirlwind Soldier's book of poetry called Memory Songs. So since that time, in 1993, we only missed 1 year, and not quite sure. I don't remember exactly. I think it was 2008, but I could be wrong on that. Anyway, we have been in a functioning entity ever since then. We've had members from many tribes throughout the state, and we lost several of our members to the the White Temple couple from Standing Rock. We had Eldon Lawrence, one of our mentors, James Well, and there are probably others that I'm not aware of, but we've been together for so long that we've had a kind of a revolving door for membership, which began very interestingly with an application. We had to apply, and we had to provide evidence that we were already publishing. We had activity out there in the written word, and individuals who were aspiring to were asked to submit record of their tribal enrollment so that they would be legitimately members of a federally enrolled tribe of the Ocheti Shakoi. And we also had to provide a copy of something that had been published. Could have been anything, essay, poem, fiction, nonfiction. Didn't really matter as long as we had a literary work out there that we could submit toward an application. So over that time, we have had a number of publishing experiences. We went for a time self-publishing using Pine Hill Press in Sioux Falls. We had Florstein, her press in Sisseton did, I believe, one of the anthologies. In addition to that, she asks for others in the society to submit to her magazine, which was J. Wichashta. And so some of the members published work with her magazine, which was in operation for quite a long time. And there were spin-offs in different directions, and we understood that there was another organization doing something similar in Rapid City, and they sent out a call for writing to the Oak Lake Writer membership. So we had members that were there, but unfortunately, I don't have that readily handy for me to give you the name of that. But it was the young woman was a enrolled member of the Oglala Lakota Nation.
So Oak Lake has quite the history, and Lanniko, you are definitely one of our elder writers, and the project that we're going to be talking about today and getting into like a discussion about with all of you is something that's really kind of a generational reflection of the Ocheti Shakoi writing tradition. Oak Lake, I think many would argue, was very unique at its time. There weren't very many tribal writing societies. It may have been the first. And since then, there's been a lot of kind of other tribal writing groups that have formed. So that makes it really important. And I was wondering if we could switch over to Sarah Hernandez, who is, a relatively new member of Oak Lake, such as myself as well. And maybe you can start talking about the Native Reads campaign, what it is, why we're doing this podcast, and why is a project like this necessary. I think Lanniko laid out some of the history of the writing group itself, but I think it's important for people to understand that, there's a long tradition of Oceti Sakowin writers. So Sarah, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and talk about Native Reads?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Hernandez. I'm Sichangu Lakota. I'm an assistant professor of Native American literature at the University of New Mexico, and I'm also the director of the Oak Lake Writers Society. So I started working on this project, Native Reads, last year while I was working at First Nations Development Institute, which is a Native nonprofit that is committed to helping tribes reclaim their assets. And they started to think about how can they empower tribes to reclaim assets such as their intellectual property, so like our oral stories, print literature, art. And so one of my colleagues proposed that for Native American Heritage Month, we start a one-read program. And I think we quickly started to realize that we weren't going to find one book that was representative of every tribe. There are 573 tribes, and they each have their own unique culture, language, and literary tradition. So we decided that instead of focusing on just one book, we were actually going to focus on one tribal nation and their literary tradition. The folks at First Nations knew that I worked with the Oak Lake Writers Society, and they asked us to work on this Native Reads project, which is a national reading campaign to increase knowledge and awareness of literature from a specific tribe or region. For 200 years, our literatures have been defined and articulated by people outside of our communities. And so really the purpose of Native Reads was to ensure that tribal people and communities were telling that story on their own terms, which is why we developed Native Reads. We really wanted members of the community to define and articulate that literary tradition themselves. So what we did with Native Reads is first we surveyed tribal members about the books that they thought were most important and impactful in their communities. It was a fairly small survey, only I believe 40 or 50 people took the survey, but from the survey I feel like we learned a lot of really important information. I think the most important information that we learned from the survey was that people of a younger generation weren't reading or accessing books by writers from their own tribal communities. I believe the survey indicated that people between 30 and 50 years old had never read a book by somebody from their tribal community. And so quickly we started to realize that there was a big gap, and that we have, this really rich and complex literary tradition, but nobody is reading it or studying it as such. And so with Native Reads, we tried to compile a bibliography of Oceti Sakowin writers. We compiled a literary history that shows that our writers have been writing and publishing for more than 200 years. And then we identified a selection committee who started to read through some of these books and identified 10 books that we thought were critical and foundation to understanding Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. And so we identified these 10 books, and really that's what Native Reads is. It's this series of 10 books that are important to understanding our communities. And we use this information to publish a brochure about our literary history, discussion guides about these 10 different books. And we want to develop other educational resources so that these books are taught in school and are accessible at libraries, because right now they're not.
Yeah, it's such an important project for many reasons. Obviously, the Lakota and Dakota people, are very famous, right? We always say like there's two kinds of people in this world. There's the Lakota and Dakota people, and then there's people who want to be us. But also, I think that there's volumes, there's libraries filled on our history. And what most people don't know is that, we have this long intellectual tradition that predates, the writing itself through oral history, through telling our own histories and our own stories. But also, the folks that Lanniko had just mentioned, such as Vine Deloria, Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who are part of our writing traditions, were powerhouses in the native and the founding of Native studies. And so this program, this Native Reads program, really gives voice to this longer tradition that both Cookland and Vine Deloria Jr. were a part of. And so with that, I want to turn it over to some of the committee members. Let's start with Gabrielle Tateskanskan. Can you talk about why you agreed to sit on the Native Reads Selection Committee, and just talk a little bit about that process and the books that are on that final list?
Sure. The reason I agreed to be part of the selection committee is that I'm also an educator, and I saw the need for keeping the books from our literary tradition alive. And I think one of the things that young people often don't see for themselves is how courageous people from the Oceti were in defending their ways of being. And the literary tradition, I think, documents the efforts to keep the culture alive. And many of the writers lived the activities and that they are writing about, and experienced many of the injustices. And so I thought it was important for young people to be able to have access to these works and understand why they're important to the culture. And I think one thing about Dakota people being courageous is that they've never, it's part of our warrior tradition not to run away from fearful situations, but to run towards it and to help others. It's part of our value system. Courage is one of the cardinal virtues, as well as the need to protect family and homelands. Those are all events that the various writers document. The courageousness of the people to defend their ways of being and their homelands, in spite of some very horrific events that they had to go through. Things like massacres and federal laws that outlawed Dakota people from Minnesota. There's many examples of courageous leadership that didn't run away in fear, but that they faced the obstacles, and they tried to protect their society, their people, and their families. And I think these works are very important because they document those efforts, and those are the kinds of people that we need today. And what's happening in society today with COVID-19 is an example of how our communities have rallied to protect themselves again against a danger. And I think that's really an important quality. It's, per capita, tribal people, have, the highest participation in, the military forces. It's things like that that I think young people need to know the leadership that they come from, and that that leadership gives hope to make the world and the earth a better place.
Let's turn to Patti Bordeaux. Patti, can you introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about why you agreed to sit on the Native Reads Selection Committee and what you learned?
Yes. I'm Patti Bordeaux Nelson. I am from the Sicangu Oyate, Rosebud, South Dakota. And when I was asked to be a part of the committee, it was really an honor for me. I think, first of all, just as a grandmother and an elder, and just thinking back about my own education, growing up in White River, South Dakota, that in those formative years, there certainly our voice wasn't present at all in the school. And even when I went to college, our voice wasn't present either. And it wasn't until the 1970s, while I was living in Eugene, Oregon, I had an opportunity to sit or to attend a symposium on racism. And it was there for the first time that I really heard our voices telling the truth about our history. And, growing up in White River in a, white community going to a public school, it was very, it wasn't an easy thing. And there was always kind of like a tension, things that I didn't understand because my grandparents were kind of quiet about our history. And I probably some of it was fear. Um, and so there was lots of things that I didn't know until I had that opportunity to listen in on that symposium, and it was just like my eyes were opened up. And so it's been a long journey to come to this place where I'm sitting at today, to hear our voices really coming to fruition, to really, I guess, to really be a part of that has been really an honor for me, and it's important for for our youth. And all the things that Gabrielle said, I was just nodding my head, just thinking of the process that we've had to come in order, as Ochete Shakoni people, to arrive at the place that we're at. And it's so important for our youth to know where they come from, what their legacy, the rich heritage that they come from. So it's been a real honor to be a part of this process. So I'm just very honored.
Great. Let's turn to Tashi Barondeau. Tashi, can you introduce yourself and talk about your participation on the Native Roots Selection Committee?
Sure. My name is Tasiyagnunpa Barondeau, and my family is Itazipcho and Oglala. I'm enrolled in the Oglala Sioux tribe, and I was born in Pine Ridge. I became a member of Oak Lake. 2004 was my first retreat. And I was a college student at SDSU. I had been an English major, and then I was sort of transitioning into journalism. And even in high school, I had moved from actually the Kadoka school. I went to grade school kind of all over. And then my junior high was in Kadoka. My freshman year was in Kadoka, which was and sometimes a very difficult experience in that it's a border town. And so we moved to Volga, which is outside Brookings, for the rest of high school, my mom and I. And her settler family is from the Brookings County area. And so I kind of just wanted to, kind of buckle down and think about going to college. And I was always a big reader when I was a kid. And so I had this idea that I was going to, study English and Native studies both, because I had a bit of a culture shock coming to Volga, where I'd left a border town. Our existence wasn't under question, at least. And when I got here, there was just this like amnesia that tribal people existed, even though there's Flandreau and Sisseton and stuff. It was just this very strange landscape I found myself in, as far as the human, I guess, literal whitewashing of what I was seeing. And it didn't change once I got to SDSU. And that was very disappointing to me, except for little pockets. And so one of my professors was Dr. Charles Woodard, and that's how I was invited to Oak Lake. And I think so. I studied journalism. I consider myself a journalist by trade, I guess, and a blogger, and then I'm a mother as well. And so I think I give credit to Oak Lake for raising me as far as like my secondary ed. I found college to be very difficult, in not so much the academic way, but just, well, in a lot of the ways that people find it complicated. And so Oak Lake was about the only thing that made any real sense to me. So it's what kept me, that and a couple of other professors are the ones who really kept me interested in learning and reading and all of that. And yet at the same time, somehow, I kind of got spoiled too. I got to hear from some really amazing people as part of Oak Lake, and didn't buckle down and read some of the stuff they were actually writing, which I felt very foolish later. So once you're in your 30s, you kind of start thinking, So I was very pleased to be invited to the selection committee, and really start reading those works a little more carefully. And yeah, so.
And cool. And so let's turn to Joel Waters. Can you talk a little bit about who you are and how you ended up on the Native Read Selection Committee and what you learned from it?
Sure. My name is Joel Waters. I'm Oglala, Lakota, and Sicangu. And I got introduced through to Native Reads through the Oak Lake Writers Society, which I've been a member of since 2002. And, since becoming part of Oak Lake, I've been published here and there, mainly in the book edited by Adrian Lewis, the late Adrian Lewis, Shedding Skin. And there was like multiple things I learned, but just being on the book community, reading the books themselves, because I was familiar with most of those works and most of the authors' works, but reading it, it kind of gave me more a better feel as to like why their books were so important and why they made the top 10 in the first place, and it just really kind of opens you up to, even though you think you may like know stuff as a writer, you're always learning new things, and just reading them, you kind of get that sense of relearning or learning new stuff, and uh, it's just like a kind of a humbling experience too, to read across all the genres and know that these people are from your tribes, and that they represent all of us, and that was just you know a fun thing to be a part of, and I think culturally important. That's about all I have to say on that.
And lastly, we'll return back to Lanniko. Lanniko, I don't think you got the opportunity to introduce yourself. Do you want to introduce yourself and then maybe talk about your participation in the selection committee?
Sure. Well, first off, let me say I'm Minikanjo Lakota on my dad's side and Hunkpapa Hidatsa on my mom's side. So my experience with this Native Reads was so fulfilling. I felt like I was born again into another experience. I've been teaching on reservation, Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, and unfortunately, when I was teaching on Cheyenne River, I had the guidelines to follow that were attached to an agreement with the tribe with Northern State University, and so our curriculum was pretty much guided by their choices on the main campus in Aberdeen. And as a result of that, curriculum materials, our course selections, our texts, and all that was not really something that I didn't like the way that was set up. I wanted our own people to have a voice in what was going on, especially on a reservation, since the tribal colleges are chartered to provide the education for the people, and very little of it had been happening where we were able to read the materials that were of our own people. So that was my reason for saying yes to Sarah when she asked me if I would like to sit on a committee. I thought it was terribly important for educators like myself who have taught all the way from grade school clear up to the college level and not having had the freedom to be able to shape learning experiences for writing and really even thinking and recovering tribal history that um, some individuals like myself had not had a deep and abiding saturation of throughout my life. At a very young age, ended up in a federal boarding school, and then when things were starting to make sense, and I was learning what that was all about, I ended up going to mission school, and both of those experiences, one very military and the other very denominationally oppressive, had a way of making it difficult for one to have a sense of what the future would be for them in meeting myself. So when I was asked if I would like to be on this committee, um, right away I could see that Standing Rock should have as their master text the book that was written by Josephine Wagner. Actually, Emily Levine edited the works of Josephine Wagner. And that book is like many other books in this selection of the 200, I guess it's well past 200. But of the top 10, we have lots of young people who have been in schools, even on the reservation, where their own people are not teaching. The leadership for instruction and how to develop as an individual. Um, those roles are not often filled by our own people. So it's very, very difficult for young people to have a sense of confidence in themselves, have a sense of their purpose in life, how well they should be connected if they are not to their communities. All of these made it very easy for me to say yes to Sarah. The other thing that I found very disturbing in the many years that I've been involved in book clubs and even wrote a few reviews, and some of them were published. They were all books that were by non-native people, and they were books that were I felt needed to be scrutinized. Like, for instance, books like Lakota Woman and Ohitika Woman. That those books, like those books, and so many more that are making the national bestsellers, and they're covering our culture by non-natives who have found a way to our homeland and camp out and take our stories, very much the same way that early settlers came in and did away with our buffalo because there was a market for every part of it in England and Europe as well. So I came to Oak Lake Riders kind of with a chip on my shoulder. I was thinking we need to do something serious, and it was very disturbed in my sense of direction about how we should have a path of being American and have a voice as Americans here too, but we're a tribal people, and so we tend to want to look to our own ways of making that happen. And when it wasn't happening in places where I felt that very, very good thinkers and people with ideals that came out of our homelands were not part of the Voices of America, made me very excited to be a part of this Native Reads. So, looking back on my teaching career, I've had some wonderful experiences with reading and writing coming out of some of those people that were on the fringe of Native um, literary storytelling. Um, I'm thinking about the author who wrote Where the Red Fern Grows. There were so many young people in some of the schools that I taught where they were reluctant to read. Anything they had to read was not exactly helping to shape their character or give them a sense of connection to their home. And books like that made me think about where are our books and where are our authors. So I started doing what I could to bring those elements and authors into my classroom, which reminds me also that Elizabeth Cook Lynn must tell you that as a tribal college instructor, I found that participating in the Native Reads book campaign led me to something that I had not really wasn't aware of, and in this for the sense that it brought to me, which was the kind of um, curriculum that Native instructors would have by following someone who had she took it upon herself to organize a historical panorama of literature throughout her whole career. So when we had to read New Indians' Old Wars, I wish I had that class as a young adult going to become a American Indian Studies educator or whatever. If I was 40, 50 years younger, I'd be jumping up and down to be in that class, because what she did was open up the whole of the core of curriculum for the Oceti Sakowin in places that we had not really found we had connections, historical connections. And there were some other tribes as well. But she brought me to the understanding that in order for you to really have a sense of where we came from, we need to decolonize some of our literary choices to make sense of what and who we are.
Yeah. And I think Lanniko makes a really good point. That's what we were trying to accomplish with Native Reads, was to decolonize our literary tradition. So as part of Native Reads, the Oak Lake Writers Society, they developed a criteria by which we could evaluate these books. And so as part of our criteria, we wanted to ensure that every book that appeared on this list was authentic. So the author must be a citizen of an Oceti Sakowin nation. Co-author texts weren't eligible for consideration. It had to be a text solely authored by a Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota writer. The book has to promote the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So the book has to impart Oceti Sakowin culture, language, history, and social values. The other criteria is that it must promote sovereignty. The books must protect and defend tribal sovereignty in our homelands. The book had to challenge Native American stereotypes. So these books couldn't romanticize, sensationalize, exploit, or further oppress Oceti Sakowin citizens, which Lanniko mentioned was a problem early on in her career. And then the books must be accessible and readable. The books still had to be available in print and accessible to a broad audience. So we, as the Oak Lake Writers Society, developed this criteria and then used this criteria to identify, like I said, 10 books that we thought were critical and foundational to understanding our communities.
And can you talk a little bit about those 10 books and
Sure.
the organization of those 10 books? Because if people go online, they can find the pamphlet for the Native Reads campaign on the First Nations Institute Development Institute website, but also at the Oak Lakes Writers Society website. And you had created a little timeline and a chronology. Maybe you can just kind of go over the rationale behind that.
Yeah, so for this project, we developed what we called the story keeping timeline. And we realized, I guess, throughout the process of evaluating these books, is that every single one of these writers, intentionally or unintentionally, was building upon the writer who came before him or her. And so as we were reviewing these books, we realized that each one of these writers spoke to a different important moment in our culture and history. And so as we were trying to narrow down these books, what we decided to do is we decided to make a top 10 list. And this top 10 list, like you said, is ordered chronologically, starting with the oral tradition, which we defined in our literary timeline as time immemorial. And we thought the author who was the best representation of the oral tradition is Joseph Marshall, who's a Sicangu Lakota writer who often writes about stories that he heard from his grandparents. So he's one of the first writers to appear on this timeline. And then after Joe Marshall, we talk about Ella Deloria's Water Lily, which was set before it was published in 1988. She actually wrote it in the 1940s, but her book centers on a pre-reservation period. So that's the second book noted on the literary timeline. And then from there, we look at Charles Eastman, who is also sort of in this pre-colonial period where, as a young man, he lived with his traditional family and then became one of the first boarding school writers. And so he's the third writer on our list and sort of marks this transition from a pre-colonial period to settler colonialism. And then from Eastman, we go on to Josephine Wagner, who was writing in the 1920s and 1930s and gathering stories from, a number of different elders. She felt like a lot of these stories in the culture and history was disappearing as a result of colonization. And she collected all of these stories in a number of reports, and her work was never published during her lifetime. She she never actually saw her book published. It wasn't until 2013 that Wagner's family actually went back and published all of her writing and research in this really massive volume. It's 824-page book. But she spent her entire life collecting all this information, and because of the overt racism that she experienced during her lifetime, she was never able to get that book published until recently. But she's another writer who also was writing during this period of settler colonialism. After Josephine Wagner, the timeline starts to look at some of the writers who wrote probably during the civil rights movement, during the Red Power movement, and they would write about our culture and our history, termination, the resistance era. And so these are writers like Ed Valandra's Not Without Our Consent, which focuses on the Lakota resistance to termination in the 1950s. And then you already talked a little bit earlier about Vine Deloria Jr. and Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who really helped establish the field of Native American studies as this legitimate academic discipline. So they're included on our top 10 list. Their books, Custardized for Your Sins and Anti-Indianism in Modern America. And then we shift to the 90s, and another author we include on our list is one of our charter members of the Oak Lake Writers Society, Lydia Whirlwind Soldier, who wrote the book Memory Song. And we felt like Lydia's book really was really one of the first books that, like Lanniko said, that our writers published. It was the emergence of this new tribally specific voice. And so we include Lydia's book on our top 10. From there, we look at Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, and then your book, Our History is the Future, as writers who are helping guide us toward this new future of sovereignty and self-determination. And so those are the 10 authors on our list. And like you said, you could find this whole timeline in the Native Reads brochure that we developed with First Nations Development Institute. But I think it's a really important resource. Like I said, for so long, people assumed we didn't have our own literary tradition. And with this project, what we're showing is that, we have this really rich and complex literary tradition that has endured for, more than 200 years.
And Lanniko brought this up, and I think it's really important that the spirit behind the Oak Lake Writers Society really lies with the work and the advocacy of Elizabeth Cook Lynn. And I think each one of us has our own relationship with her. She's a kind of like a constant voice in my own head. And when I'm writing, am I being that authentic voice? Am I authentically portraying not just our culture and history accurately, but also am I accurately portraying the history of this settler nation accurately? And she's held my feet to the fire plenty of times on that. But I think this process has really revealed a lot about our own intellectual traditions. So maybe we can turn to let's just go with Tashi. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your favorite book on the top 10 list and why you chose it.
Yeah, actually, I kind of, it was funny. Sarah sent me some materials because we're still working on building the Native Reads material on the website, and including these podcasts, whole podcast series that we're doing. And so I was reviewing it, and I had written a little piece on what my favorite book was, and and at the time I had written about water lily, which is true. I mean, if there's probably a book that I'm just going to sit down and want to read, water lily is probably it. In a huge part because I think it's a work of literary genius, and I don't say that lightly. By using a fictional vehicle, Ella Deloria was able to reveal how not just I mean it sounds simple. So she's talking about these characters that's pre European settlement. They're still in the camp circle, and really we need to get away from the word camp as well somehow, because really we were an urban culture. We just don't think about that, because she even talks about in there about how they went camping, and that was not the same thing as being in the village together, even though we moved where we lived. So it really makes you stop and rethink everything you think you knew about how our people lived. And she also, if you know anything about Ella Deloria, she was one of those rare individuals who got to spend time in many of she was Dakota, but she got to spend a lot of time with Lakota people because of her parents' work. And and I can relate to that a little bit because, I moved East River from West River, and Oak Lake was really instrumental in me getting to spend time with Dakota people. And, you said earlier that, we want to, everybody, there's Lakota and Dakota and everybody wants to be us. Well, I think a lot of times too is, us Oglala Lakota think we're like the Great Sioux Nation on our own sometimes. And we lose a lot of we lose a lot when we get like that. So it was a very humbling but also like character building experience for me to be around Dakota. So a few years ago, I moved back West River up to Cheyenne River and worked at a newspaper, and just having that, and I just realized living back within a reservation that a lot of us do not have that experience. And so Ella Deloria is showing that, in fiction back then. But fast forward then to Cannonball and the Standing Rock protests, which I was in the middle of moving back here, but and I had spent some years working on pipeline issues. So as a mother, I had to make some choices on what I was doing. And so I didn't get to go to the camps, but in being Facebook friends and knowing people in real life who were up there, and hearing the stories about how the Ocheti Shakoan, our personalities, how they came back, and the bands, and how the circles came together, and the honestly, Nick, and I'm not saying this like every time I read about in your book about where you're in Bismarck and they go, oh, they smell like smoke, that power of fire, and they start, the people are like start attacking, for lack of a better word, the protest that was going on up there. I start tearing up because it's just so indicative of how of this beautiful place, and because I'm coming at it from feeling like thinking about water lily and going into that. So then fast forward a few months, and I was one of the things I got to help with as part of the selection committee was working on study guides. And so my cousin, our relative, Edward Valandra, who wrote Not Without Our Consent, I had glanced through it. Elizabeth Cookland thinks highly of it. Many of us know what it's about. but it's pretty hefty reading. And so I had glanced through it as part of the committee, and I knew what it said, but like I didn't really I guess develop a relationship with that book until I did the study guide for it, because then I really had to sit down and read very carefully and know what I was talking about. And that book, it was also kind of life-changing. Like if you haven't read that book, and especially if you're from Western South Dakota or a ranch community, it will blow you away. Like to me, that book was also life-changing in a whole different way. It just made things make so much more sense than things I had seen as a kid myself. I think Patti kind of mentioned that. Anyway, so that was really good. So yeah, I guess, it's kind of a toss up. And all the books are really good. Soul of Indian is also another book that I think very well of. And of course so we can't name all of them, obviously, but yeah, so that's a long answer for what should be a short question, but it's not that simple.
Well, Patti, let's go to you. And what was your favorite book from the top 10 list?
I guess I would have to say that it was the Lakota Way, and I think it's because I know Joe's family, grew up with them, and it took me a long time before I read the book, and I think part of it was that when you grow up with somebody and somebody, for me it was like, oh, what if I'm disappointed in the book or something, and so I didn't. I guess I didn't really read it until I was a part of the committee, and as I read it, for me it was like coming home. And it reminded me, I was raised by my grandparents also, and so it was just like the stories, and it just kind of opened up my memory to things that I had forgotten, stories that my grandparents had told me, and it was really an amazing experience for me, and so I would say that was my favorite, my very favorite book of the 10. But then when I read Not Without Our Consent, that was it sat on the shelf for a little bit because I kind of thought it would be somewhat like dry reading. But when I got into it, and again, in that process of going through that book, I really developed, I guess, a relationship with it, in the sense that I realized that my grandfather was part of that process that Ed is talking about in his book, and it just brought me back to memories of, I was I don't know, probably 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade in there, and my grandfather was on the council for Rosebud, and he would come home at the end of meetings, and he was talking about these things that Ed is writing in his book, and I was like, oh my goodness, I was a kid just hearing pieces of conversation and not really paying attention. And so when I read his book, it was just like, I just realized what important work that my grandfather and that whole group of tribal leaders were doing at that time. And there was one, just in his afterward, there's one sentence that I highlighted, and it just sort of like has stayed with me. And Ed says, finally, the state termination forces have never fully recovered from the 1964 Lakota engineered upset, especially since Public Law 83-280 was amended in April 1968 to include a native consent provision. And then he said, Lakota, and I'm skipping several lines, but then in the final sentence he says, Lakota consent is an established reality in South Dakota state politics. For this, we have the Lakota people and the Lakota leaders of the 1950s and 60s, the generations of our parents and grandparents to thank. And that was just really, I could just feel the quiver in my voice even right now as I read that, because I didn't really remember or realize that my grandfather was a part of that. And so that was a very, I guess it was just really, I guess, touching, emotional for me, to read that too. So it's kind of interesting that Tasi and I kind of end up with the same two favorite books, but Water Lily was another one that I liked too. It just, I don't know, it just sort of it helped me to understand things, stories that I'd heard from, my grandmother, little pieces of things that happened. And I didn't fully understand it, being young. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. And then all of a sudden, when I'm reading some of these books, such as Water Lily and Not Without Our Consent, and then even Joseph Marshall's book, it's just been a really amazing experience for me. So I am very thankful for Sarah asking me to be a part of this committee. So thank you.
I think that's a really important point that both you and Tashi bring up, especially about Edward Villandro's book, because he details and documents a history that's pre, Red Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and that history tends to steal the show, right? And this was an incredibly pivotal moment in the 1950s. You had the creation of the Pixelone dams, which is well documented in some of the work that the Oak Lake Writer Society has put out, but also the coalescence of termination and relocation legislation that was literally trying to liquidate tribes. And the foresight of these tribal leaders at this time, specifically in the United Sioux Tribes Organization, really, we have them to thank that we're still tribal people to this day. We still have our citizenship. So yeah, that's a really important point that you make, Patti. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask Joel, maybe you can talk about a book that you personally thought should have been on the top 10 list but didn't make it.
Oh yeah, there's probably just maybe one or two books of poetry by some more contemporary writers, but with poetry it's kind of a harder subject because especially it didn't embody the criteria that we were looking for, and I guess the criteria itself was probably just a little too strict for my taste, but it is the consensus. But books by like Tiffany Midge or Trevino Brings plenty, more modern day books, those kind of, well, especially Tiffany's had a pretty deep impact on me when I was first in college and reading native writers. It was a little disappointing that more people that I've read didn't make it, but that's what makes this that's what made this selection such a hard process, I think, for everybody, is because we all have our different point of views and who we think is relevant and important, and plus that poll thing that we did didn't help the matters, but it is what it is.
What's the poll thing?
Sarah?
Oh, the survey, you mean?
Oh, survey, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And then I think one thing I would also just mention about this project is we really should acknowledge that this is just a starting point. Right, very few people have had these conversations about Oceri Sakowin literature. In fact, I think this poll, or that the survey that we did, is probably the first time tribal members have actually been surveyed about their reading preferences or their access to these literary texts. And so one of the things I like to point out is that this Native Reads project shouldn't be considered the last word on this topic. I feel like it's a starting point, and I hope that it really does start to open up conversations about Oceri Sakowin literature and this literary tradition. So I really do just want to emphasize that it's a starting point, and we couldn't include everybody in the top 10, and we have a bibliography that we're attempting to compile But even that bibliography is ongoing, and we're going to keep adding to it as we learn about more writers. But this, for me, was just, a starting point. And I think it's a pretty good starting point, but it's a starting point to get these conversations going.
Well, I think we should add too, it's a starting point that has a methodology behind it, which, is just a fancy word for talking about there's some really good reasons that came out of Oak Lake, who Oak Lake is as a society. And I think I've said this before, but culturally, a society holds its members to a certain standard. And I feel like Oak Lake has allowed for accountability within its membership. We have to be enrolled members. We were supposed to have published something. There's different pieces to that, and it's not to be, like I joke, I'm a journalist that gets to hang out with scholars. It's not to be like, eliminating. We don't over focus on genre. Nobody has to have their 4-year degree or anything like that. But there are some things that we do share and remind each other. And so I think coming out of that, that's one reason why the selections were made. And it's something that I hope that writers, as they're writing, I know I do. Like Nick mentioned, having Liz in his head. I feel like I have that too, and some Craig probably and Ed mixed in. And, really kind of looking at why we picked what we did, I think is kind of a fascinating process. And yeah, one of the books, like you mentioned, what's your favorite book? Really life-changing book was New Indians, Old Wars, excuse me. And we didn't pick that book by Elizabeth. Yeah. And, we didn't pick that one for the list. We picked Anti-Indianism in Modern America, which is it's an excellent book, but the other title really, really touched me. And so we read a lot more books than what is in the top 10, which people maybe don't realize. So, Liz has been after us for years to read. She's always brought books and wanted us to read because, as she says, writers, who's a writer unless you're reading? And so in some ways this made us do our homework. And I just think it's a really good thing to be able to lean into and have know that there's some, not authority, that's such a horrible word, that just some vetting, I guess, that, if you're not real sure where to start with, because I think if you know anything about tribal literature, there's a lot of crap out there too by non-Indians or people who made false claims. And so sometimes I think people get scared away from Native American literature for that reason. And now here is a project that has vetted all of these books. And there's also going to be an upcoming bibliography that, we're deciding how much further that vetting goes, but that will still be, something that people can utilize, I think. So it is a starting point, but it's a dang good starting point.
Maybe I'll pitch that question to Lanniko. So Tashi was saying that there was a selection criteria in what made it into the list. And you had mentioned earlier, the book Ohitika Woman didn't make it into this list because it wasn't, authored by entirely by an Oceti Sakowin author, but it was actually written with a non-Indigenous author. And we can see that with, the work of somebody like Albert Whitehat, who does really valuable work, but nonetheless wrote in collaboration with a non-Indigenous author. So can you maybe elaborate on that and why that was such a critical criteria for selection?
Well, yes, for one reason, a lot of times let's just put it this way. We've got our own language. We have our own ideological foundation to that language. We have experiences and history and ways in which we interpret our presence here. And when things move to English, when the topic, whatever is being discussed, moves to English, some of that is lost in translation. And some of that is misunderstood by the writer who is non-native, may be interpreted in ways that are not authentic. And so I think what we were striving to do is to keep the voice authentic from the people themselves. Living in a non-native community, as I do, I'm often asked questions like, "How did you people get through winter? Wow, did people freeze in those teepees?" There's so much ignorance out there that their answers that I give them was basically, there's so much that you probably want to know besides your question that you may want to read this. And so I've always given titles away to people. And the other part of that was when we do have um, an opportunity to have something to share, it has been historically going through gatekeepers of the canon, the literary canon of American literature, and we've had those gates only open to non-natives. And so when we have an opportunity to speak authentically from the homeland and the individuals that are sharing what they can, um, Albert, I know, would have been a wonderful person to have had all of his works written in such a manner that, or said, it's written, I should say, published in such a manner that we would have learned so much more than what he has been able to embed in his learning how to speak and write and think Lakota. That is an example. Another example of why I think we need to have our own perspective out there is books like Ron Goodman's book that was Lakota Constellations, Cosmology. The whole idea of our harvesting not just the plants and the medicines and the ways in which we lived along the river, the history we have with our relationship with the buffalo. We also have harvesting of our stories, and I think it's about time we establish ourselves in such a manner that we challenge these non-native people to read the books that are on that 10 list, to get them started to thinking about who else shares this land with them and what kind of history we have for the care and keeping of it, because that's the beginning of forming relationships that see a future for our youth.
Right, and that really gets to what Sarah was saying earlier, that this is a starting point for creating something that other scholars and educators, hopefully Ocheti Shakome scholars and educators, can build upon. So, I guess with that, I'll just turn it over to Mabel with that final question. Mabel, if you want to answer it, how can the Oak Lake Writers Society and other scholars and educators build on this work, and what do you see as sort of the lasting impact of Native Reads Ocheti Shakome stories?
Yeah, I think that it's really important, all of this work with Native Reads and creating a bibliography, especially for education. What Gabrielle had to say about being an educator and looking for resources and for young people to give them to give them a picture of that courage that our people have had, and through these writings and the stories that come from our own voices, so that they can be encouraged to have a voice and have courage for themselves as well, is really, really important, and really touched my heart what she had to say. And it's so true. I am an educator, and I've been working in English language arts, teaching literature and to students for more than 10 years. And in that time, it was very hard for me to find authentic Lakota, Dakota, Nakota writers until I came in contact with the Oak Lake Writers Society, and that just opened up a whole new world for me. I mean, I knew of my mom actually posthumously worked on the LSC Deloria project, so I was very familiar with Water Lily. and she had a hand in posthumously publishing that piece, and also with Zint Galasha. And so I had that kind of background, but I didn't have a more contemporary knowledge of Oceti Sakowin writers. And they were hard to find, and it was hard to select like what pieces into, come. I'm sorry, I'm getting out of loss for words here, but it was just hard to find good writing and to think about authentic and our voices, and that wasn't romanticized or didn't have stereotypes in it. And I think I'm just repeating what everybody's been saying, but I think that the work actually, all of this comes from the Oak Lake Writers Society, what was started back in 1993 with the professors and Elizabeth Cook Lynn, and this is all just coming into, it's all been working up to this point where we can put out this, or vet writers and work, and put out this bibliography for people to read. I think it's really important, and I think that it does exactly what our mission statement for Oak Lake is preserving and defending Oceti Sakowin cultures and oral traditions, histories, and regulating and transforming representations that are inaccurate and damaging to us. So it does all of that, and it's right. It's good work, and I feel inspired, encouraged, and honored to be a part of Oak Lake and to learn about Native reads and to actually start reading all of these things. And it's just opened up a whole world and a lot of opportunities for our students. And that's what I think about, is I want them to read good literature. I want them to know that we have a voice and that we are powerful, and we can share our stories. And I don't know.
I think as a younger writer in this society, what was most mind-blowing for me was that I had read most everyone's work through the various edited collections, but also the books. And to sit in the room and be like a peer, reviewer, so to speak, with, senior writers and elder writers, and to just get that feedback for me was like something that I could never learn in school. Right. And this is me saying this as, Edward Valandra's former student, right? His class was good. Don't get me wrong. But this was really where I learned to write and was actually inspired to write, was from this group. And so I just want to echo what you were saying, Mabel, that it has had a huge impact on me and other writers. And, I don't want to speak for Sarah, but I'm sure it was something that, that inspired her as well.
Yeah, no, it makes me really happy to hear you guys saying this, because I think that was really the motivation for creating this Native Reads project. Like all of you, I never read any of these books probably until I got to grad school. When I was in my mid-20s, I hadn't read a lot of these books myself. So I'm so happy that, this resource is something valuable that students can use, hopefully for generations. And like I said, I do see it as a starting point, and I hope that we can continue to build on this and have these conversations.